Grady froze mid-step, hand instinctively hovering over the survival knife strapped to his belt. The sound came again, a faint, uneven whimpering like a wounded animal, but off, too rhythmic. Too deliberate. "Well, that's not creepy or anything," he muttered under his breath, scanning the dense trees surrounding him. The forests on the colony planet Rhea were typically quiet, save for the occasional rustle of wind or distant drone of alien insects. This was different. The noise seemed to echo, bouncing through the trees before settling in the direction of the abandoned research outpost a mile back. Ethan frowned. He'd passed the place a few times during his hikes, just another relic of some corporation that had pulled stakes when the planet didn't pan out as a cash cow. He'd always steered clear. Places like that had a way of attracting trouble. The sound came again, more urgent this time. "Damn it," Ethan sighed, shifting the strap of his pack and turning toward the outpost. Curiosity killed the cat, but he didn't have it in him to walk away. The facility loomed larger as he approached, its rusted metal walls half swallowed by creeping vines. Most of the windows were either shattered or missing entirely, giving the structure a haunted, hollow look. Ethan stepped through the crumbled doorway, his boots crunching on glass shards and debris. The whimpering was louder now, coming from somewhere deeper inside. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing. "Anybody here?" No answer, just that same eerie sound. Ethan followed it through a maze of corridors until he reached a heavy steel door, slightly ajar. The noise was coming from behind it. He pushed it open with a grunt and froze. Inside the room was a containment chamber, a large glass enclosure with faintly glowing panels along the edges. And inside the chamber was something. It looked like a wolf, but not. Its fur shimmered with shifting hues like oil on water, and its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, an unsettling mix of blue and gold. The creature was curled up, its sides heaving with labored breaths. A makeshift bandage stiff with dried blood was wrapped around one of its legs. "What the hell?" Ethan muttered. The wolf-like creature let out a weak, pitiful whine, its ears twitching in response to his voice. It tried to lift its head but lacked the strength. Ethan approached the chamber cautiously, his instincts screaming at him to leave it alone. He'd heard plenty of horror stories about abandoned experiments on colony worlds. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't natural. He could see it more clearly now. Beneath the shimmering fur, its body was gaunt, ribs visible beneath its hide. Its wounds, several gashes along its flank, and the poorly bandaged leg looked infected. "Someone really did a number on you, huh?" Ethan murmured. The creature's eyes flicked toward him with a mix of fear and something else. Curiosity. He hesitated, weighing his options. He could leave now, pretend he never saw it. But something about the way it watched him, desperate yet resigned, made his stomach twist. "This is a bad idea," he muttered, pulling his multi-tool from his pocket. The lock on the chamber door was old and brittle. A few careful pries and it gave way with a sharp crack. The door swung open, letting out a faint hiss of stale air. The creature flinched but didn't move otherwise, its eyes glued to Ethan. "Easy," he said softly, kneeling at a safe distance. "I'm not here to hurt you." Slowly, he unzipped his pack and pulled out the first aid kit. The creature's nose twitched as it watched him, every movement of its head sluggish and strained. "This is probably a terrible idea," Ethan muttered to himself, setting the kit on the ground. He opened it up and pulled out a disinfectant spray and some gauze. "But I can't just leave you like this." He edged closer, one hand extended in what he hoped was a non-threatening gesture. The creature's ears flattened and it bared its teeth weakly, but it didn't have the strength to do more. "Yeah, I wouldn't trust me either," Ethan said, "but I'm all you've got right now." The creature tensed as he reached out, but it didn't lash out. Carefully, he sprayed the disinfectant onto its wounds, murmuring soothing nonsense as it flinched and whimpered. "Hang in there, buddy, just a little more," he said, wrapping the gauze around its leg. The creature huffed, its glowing eyes locked on his face. "There," he said, sitting back on his heels. "That's the best I can do for now. You're lucky I'm not squeamish." The creature didn't respond, but it didn't look quite as tense as before. "You're not gonna make it out here on your own," Ethan said, more to himself than the wolf. "Guess I've got no choice but to take you back with me." The creature tilted its head slightly, as if it understood. "Great, now I'm talking to aliens." Ethan reached for his pack and gingerly lifted the creature into his arms. It weighed less than he expected, its body frail beneath its shimmering fur. "Okay, buddy," he said, adjusting his grip. "Let's get out of here before I regret this." Back at the cabin, Ethan set the creature down gently on an old, patched-up rug near the fireplace. It shifted slightly, its glowing eyes darting around the small room as if taking inventory of the space. The fire crackled in the hearth, filling the cabin with a soft orange glow. Ethan caught himself staring at the strange creature, its fur shimmering faintly in the flickering light like it had been dusted with stardust. "Well, this is cozy, huh?" He dropped his pack near the door and ran a hand through his hair, unsure of what to do next. He wasn't exactly experienced in playing nurse to injured. Bioengineered alien wolves. Was that even what it was, a wolf? If it wasn't, it sure had the right shape. Almost too perfect, like someone had taken the idea of a wolf and made it. Sharper, sleeker. A designer predator. The creature tilted its head at him, mimicking the gesture he'd just made. Ethan froze, narrowing his eyes slightly. Slowly, he tilted his head the opposite way. The creature mirrored him again, a small, hesitant movement as if testing the waters. He blinked. "Oh, come on. You're messing with me now." The wolf thing let out a soft sound, a cross between a whine and a grunt. If Ethan didn't know better, he'd swear it was amused. "All right, buddy, let's get a closer look at those injuries." Ethan knelt beside it, careful to keep his movements slow and predictable. The shimmer of its fur was mesmerizing up close, like the surface of a calm lake catching morning sunlight. He worked quickly, peeling back the makeshift bandages it had on one leg, and that's when he saw it. Tiny, metallic threads glinted faintly just beneath its skin, trailing through the edges of the wound like veins that didn't belong. Ethan leaned in, squinting. His fingers hesitated above the injury, not quite touching it. The threads almost seemed alive, pulsing faintly with what looked like an internal energy. He exhaled slowly. "What the hell are you?" he murmured. The creature's ears flicked at the sound of his voice, but it didn't flinch or pull away. If anything, it seemed oddly calm under his scrutiny, almost as if it knew it needed his help. Ethan grabbed a pair of tweezers from his first aid kit and gently prodded the edge of one of the threads. It didn't behave like metal, it was pliant, almost organic in its flexibility. He tugged lightly, and the thread recoiled deeper into the wound like a living thing. "Okay, that's officially the weirdest thing I've seen all year," Ethan said, sitting back on his heels. He wiped his hands on his pants and sighed. "You've got some serious aftermarket work done, pal. Guessing that's courtesy of wherever you came from." The creature tilted its head again, watching him intently. Its glowing eyes never seemed to blink, which was unnerving at first, but Ethan was starting to get used to it. Sort of. He patched up the leg as best he could, leaving the strange nanotech threads alone for now. Whatever they were, they seemed to be part of the creature's biology. Tugging them out didn't seem like a great idea. Once he finished, he stood and stretched, his back popping loudly in the quiet room. All right, you're patched up, fed, and adopted into my weird little life. You need a name, though. Can't just keep calling you buddy or wolf thing. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully, glancing at the creature. It had settled onto the rug now, its head resting on its uninjured paw. Its dark fur shimmered faintly in the firelight, and the way it blended into the shadows of the room was almost uncanny. Shadow, Ethan said, the name slipping out of his mouth as the thought occurred to him. Yeah, Shadow. That fits, doesn't it? The creature raised its head slightly, tilting it in that way it always did when it was trying to mimic him. Ethan chuckled, the sound breaking the tension in the room. You like that? Shadow it is then. As if in agreement, Shadow let out a soft huff and laid its head back down. Ethan shook his head, still half convinced he was losing his mind. Great. Now I'm naming genetically engineered animals like they're stray dogs. The next few days settled into an odd, almost comfortable routine. Shadow followed Ethan everywhere, limping slightly at first, but gaining strength with each passing day. It was eerily intelligent, far more than any normal animal Ethan had ever come across. It seemed to study him, watching his every move with those glowing, unblinking eyes. One morning, Ethan was fixing a loose hinge on the cabin's front door when he felt a warm presence close behind him. He turned to find Shadow standing there, its head tilted as it watched him work. It sniffed at the toolbox on the floor and, after a moment of consideration, picked up a screwdriver in its jaws. It carried it over to Ethan and dropped it at his feet, looking up at him expectantly. Ethan stared. You're kidding, right? Shadow wagged its tail, a slow, deliberate motion that didn't feel entirely natural, like it was mimicking something it had observed rather than acting on instinct. Well, I'll be damned, Ethan said, picking up the screwdriver. Guess you're handy, huh? You want to fix the door while you're at it, Shadow huffed softly, the sound disturbingly close to a scoff. Ethan laughed despite himself, shaking his head. All right, thanks for the assist. Later that evening, Shadow provided another moment of unexpected levity. Ethan was sprawled on the couch, flipping through an old manual on Rhea 7 native flora, when Shadow decided to join him. It approached the couch cautiously, sniffing at the cushions before attempting to climb up. The creature's movements were awkward, its limbs not quite suited to the task. It finally managed to haul itself up, only to lose its balance and tumble off the other side with an audible thump. Ethan burst out laughing, the sound echoing through the cabin. Shadow scrambled back to its feet, looking more indignant than hurt. It fixed Ethan with a piercing glare as if offended by his amusement. Oh, don't give me that look, Ethan said between chuckles. You're the one who decided to play human. Shadow let out a low, grumbling sound that almost sounded like a growl but lacked any real menace. Ethan grinned and patted the cushion beside him. Come on, try again. I won't laugh this time. Promise. Shadow hesitated for a moment before cautiously climbing up again. This time, it managed to settle itself awkwardly on the cushion, its body too long and angular to fit comfortably in the way a dog might. It looked ridiculous and somehow endearing. Ethan shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. You're something else, you know that? Shadow didn't respond, but its glowing eyes softened slightly as it rested its head on the armrest. Ethan leaned back, the warmth of the fire and the quiet companionship making the cabin feel less lonely than it had in years. For the first time in a long time, he didn't mind the silence. Ethan hunched over the workbench in the corner of the cabin, a pile of disassembled gadgets and salvaged tools spread out before him. The familiar hum of his old equipment filled the air as he squinted at the tiny device clamped under his magnifier, one of the smaller pieces of tech embedded in Shadow's wounds that he'd carefully extracted after a long debate with himself. It wasn't easy convincing himself to mess with it, but the way Shadow kept twitching and whimpering in its sleep made it clear that something wasn't right. Shadow lay curled up on the rug nearby, its chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Despite its unusual appearance, it had settled into the cabin like it belonged there, though it still had moments of odd behavior that made Ethan question just how natural it was. The intelligence it displayed wasn't just canine, it was something else entirely, and that both fascinated and unsettled him. The magnifier buzzed faintly as Ethan adjusted the lens, tilting his head to inspect the delicate threads of nanotech coiled within the device. It was intricate beyond anything he'd ever worked on before, and he'd worked on plenty of advanced machinery back in his engineering days. This wasn't just advanced, it was alien in its complexity, yet strangely intuitive. The way the components meshed together reminded him of organic systems, like nerves or blood vessels. "All right," he muttered under his breath, picking up a fine-tipped soldering tool. "Let's see what makes you tick." As he worked, a pattern began to emerge. The nanotech wasn't just invasive, it was integrated into Shadow's biology. The device he was examining acted like a hub, sending signals through the metallic threads that laced Shadow's muscles and nerves. Whatever it was designed to do, it wasn't functioning properly. Instead of enhancing the creature's abilities, it was overloading them, causing the erratic behavior and the visible pain Shadow had been experiencing. Ethan leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "So, you're some kind of augmented super creature, huh? Figures. Nothing on this planet is ever simple." He glanced over at Shadow, who was now watching him intently, its glowing eyes unblinking. "You're awake," Ethan said, setting the soldering tool down. "Feel like telling me where you came from?" Shadow tilted its head, the gesture almost eerily human. Ethan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Yeah, didn't think so." He turned back to the workbench, his mind racing. If the nanotech was malfunctioning, he needed to fix it, but that was easier said than done. He didn't have the tools or the expertise to reverse engineer something this advanced. Still, it wasn't like he had much of a choice. Shadow had saved his skin on more than one occasion already, and he wasn't about to let the creature suffer because some lab tech had screwed up. As he resumed tinkering with the device, a sudden knock at the door made him freeze. Shadow's ears perked up, and it let out a low, barely audible growl. Ethan frowned, setting the magnifier aside and wiping his hands on his jeans. He wasn't expecting visitors, not out here in the middle of nowhere. The knock came again, louder this time. Ethan grabbed the survival knife from the counter and walked cautiously to the door. He cracked it open just enough to see who was outside. 3 people stood on the porch, dressed in nondescript uniforms that looked vaguely official. The one in front, a tall woman with sharp features and a clipboard, smiled politely. "Mr. Grady?" she asked, her tone professional but too polished to be genuine. "Who's asking?" Ethan replied, keeping the door partially closed. "We're with the Rhea Wildlife Conservation Initiative," the woman said, holding up an ID badge that looked suspiciously pristine. "We're conducting surveys of the local fauna and heard you might have encountered an unusual specimen recently." Ethan's grip on the door tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." The woman's smile didn't falter, but her eyes sharpened. "We understand you've been living off the grid for some time, Mr. Grady. It's not uncommon for settlers in remote areas to come across undocumented species. If you have any information, it would be in everyone's best interest to share it." Shadow let out another low growl from somewhere behind Ethan, and he fought the urge to glance back. "Sorry," he said, his tone flat. "Haven't seen anything unusual." The woman's gaze shifted past him as if trying to peer into the cabin. "Would you mind if we took a look around?" Just to be thorough. Ethan stepped forward, blocking the doorway entirely. "Yeah, I'd mind. This is private property." "You got a warrant." Her smile finally faltered, replaced by a thin-lipped expression of annoyance. "We're just trying to do our job, Mr. Grady." "It would be a shame if your lack of cooperation complicated things." "Right," Ethan said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Well, I'll be sure to let you know if I see any glowing wolves wandering around." The woman's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Ethan thought she might push the issue. But then she stepped back, motioning for the others to follow. "Very well," she said, "but I'd advise you to reconsider. Interfering with classified projects can have serious consequences." Ethan's stomach sank, but he kept his expression neutral. "Have a nice day." He shut the door before they could respond, locking it for good measure. Shadow was on its feet now, its posture tense as it watched him. "Yeah," Ethan muttered, running a hand through his hair. "That went about as well as expected." He walked over to the window, peering out cautiously as the group disappeared into the trees. Classified projects. That confirmed what he'd suspected. Shadow wasn't some random mutant. It was part of something bigger, something dangerous. And now they knew where to find it. Ethan turned back to Shadow, who was still watching him with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. "Looks like we've got a problem," he said. "They're not gonna let this go." Shadow let out a soft huff, its tail swishing once against the floor like it understood. Ethan sighed, the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. He couldn't hand Shadow over, not to them, not to anyone. But if they came back, he wouldn't have much of a choice. Not unless he did something first. He glanced back at the workbench, at the disassembled nanotech device still clamped under the magnifier. If he could figure out how to fix it, maybe he could help Shadow regain full control of its abilities. Maybe they could stay one step ahead of whoever was looking for it. "All right," he said, grabbing his tools and sitting back down. "Guess we're doing this the hard way." Shadow padded over and sat beside him, its presence oddly comforting despite the circumstances. Ethan glanced at the creature and smirked faintly. "Hope you're ready to be my lab partner, because this is gonna take a while." Shadow tilted its head, the motion almost playful, and let out a soft bark. Ethan chuckled despite himself, shaking his head. "Yeah. Let's see if we can pull this off." Ethan barely had time to step away from the workbench when the sound of boots crunching against gravel sent his nerves into overdrive. This time, the group wasn't knocking. They were back, and they weren't subtle about it. Through the cabin's cracked window, he caught a glimpse of figures moving through the trees, carrying weapons that glinted coldly in the dim light. Shadow was already on its feet, its body low and tense like a coiled spring. Its glowing eyes darted toward him, and for a moment, Ethan thought he saw something like determination in its gaze. He grabbed the nearest thing he could use as a weapon, a wrench, and crouched down next to Shadow. "They're here for you," he whispered, keeping his voice low. Shadow let out a quiet growl, acknowledging the obvious. Ethan's mind raced. The cabin wasn't much in terms of defense, a glorified box in the woods with a few locks and thin walls. They'd storm through it in minutes, but the surrounding terrain was rugged, full of natural cover and hidden pitfalls. If they were smart, they could use that to their advantage. "All right," Ethan said, gesturing for Shadow to follow him. "We're not waiting around to get cornered." The two silently slipped out the back door, Ethan's boots making barely a sound on the damp earth. The forest loomed around them like a wall of shadows, the trees stretching tall enough to blot out most of the fading light. He motioned for Shadow to stay close as they moved deeper into the woods. Low voices echoed in the distance, the pursuers spreading out as they approached the cabin. Ethan crouched behind a rocky outcrop, scanning their surroundings. He could see 3 of them now, armed with rifles and walking in a loose formation. They weren't amateurs, every movement was calculated, their eyes constantly scanning for signs of life. He bit back a curse. "Think you can handle this?" he whispered to Shadow, who was huddled beside him. The creature's ears twitched, and it gave a low, throaty growl that somehow managed to sound both eager and restrained. Ethan grinned despite himself. "Good. Let's make him work for it." The first move was simple distraction. Ethan grabbed a fist-sized rock and hurled it into the dense brush to their left. The sound of snapping branches and rustling leaves drew one of the attackers' attention immediately. The man gestured to the others and moved toward the noise, his rifle raised. Ethan and Shadow waited until the others were distracted before slipping further into the woods. It wasn't long before the group split up, each taking a different quadrant of the forest. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't a soldier, but he'd done his share of hunting on this planet. If he could think like a predator, they might have a chance. He spotted one of the attackers moving toward a narrow ravine, his attention focused on the ground as he searched for tracks. Shadow seemed to sense Ethan's plan before he even spoke. The creature crouched low, its body blending seamlessly with the undergrowth. Ethan gave a small nod, and Shadow darted off silently, a streak of shimmering black. The man didn't even see it coming. Shadow lunged from the brush, knocking the rifle out of his hands with a surprising burst of strength. Before the man could react, Shadow had him pinned, its teeth bared but stopping just short of sinking into his throat. The man froze, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Ethan stepped out from behind the trees and retrieved the rifle, his grip firm but unsure. He wasn't planning to use it, not unless he had to. "Stay quiet," he said, his voice low and steady. "And you'll walk away from this." The man nodded frantically, his eyes wide with terror. Ethan motioned for Shadow to release him, and the creature complied, backing off just enough to let the man scramble to his feet. A quick shove sent him running back toward the direction of the cabin, leaving one less pursuer to worry about. "That's one," Ethan muttered, tossing the rifle into the ravine to keep it out of circulation. Shadow looked up at him, its tail swishing once in what almost looked like approval. The two moved quickly, circling back toward the cabin to deal with the remaining threats. The layout of the area worked in their favor. Fallen logs and jagged rocks provided countless places to hide, and the attackers' flashlights only served to give away their positions. The second man made the mistake of stepping into a shallow creek that ran through the forest. The water muffled the sound of Ethan's approach until it was too late. Ethan swung the wrench, striking the man's wrist and sending his weapon tumbling into the water. The man swore loudly, clutching his injured arm, but Ethan was already gone, disappearing into the shadows with Shadow close behind. The third, however, proved more persistent. He'd taken up a position near the cabin, using the structure itself as cover. Ethan could see him through the broken window, his rifle trained on the tree line as he waited for any sign of movement. Ethan motioned for Shadow to stay low as they crept closer. He grabbed a length of rope from the pile of supplies he'd stashed behind the cabin and fashioned it into a makeshift snare. He couldn't rely on brute force alone, this one was too prepared. It took careful timing, but eventually, Ethan managed to loop the snare around the man's ankle from his concealed position. With a sharp tug, the man stumbled, his shot going wide as he fell to the ground. Shadow seized the opportunity, darting forward to knock the rifle away before the man could recover. "Call it off," the man shouted, raising his hands defensively as Shadow loomed over him. All right, we'll back off." Ethan stepped into view, keeping a safe distance. "That's funny," he said. "You didn't seem too interested in backing off a minute ago." The man's face twisted into a grimace. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. That thing isn't an animal, it's a weapon. If you let it go, it's only a matter of time before what?" Ethan interrupted. "Before it does exactly what you were planning to do to me." The man didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said enough. Ethan motioned for him to get up and start walking. "Leave. And tell whoever sent you not to come back." The man hesitated, his gaze shifting to Shadow, whose teeth were still bared menacingly. Finally, he nodded and scrambled to his feet, retreating into the woods without another word. Ethan exhaled slowly, the adrenaline finally starting to wear off. He looked down at Shadow, who was still watching the man's retreat with a low growl rumbling in its throat. "You all right?" he asked. Shadow turned to him and gave a single, curt nod, a gesture that felt oddly deliberate. "Yeah," Ethan said, leaning against the cabin wall. "Me too." Once they were sure the attackers were gone, Ethan and Shadow retreated inside, securing every window and door as best they could. The cabin was quiet again, but the tension lingered like a storm on the horizon. Ethan returned to the workbench, picking up the nanotech device he'd been working on earlier. Shadow lay down nearby, resting its head on its paws but keeping its glowing eyes fixed on him. "All right, buddy," Ethan said, his voice soft but resolute. "Let's finish this. Then we're getting out of here for good." Shadow didn't respond, but the way it watched him calm, trusting spoke volumes. Ethan smiled faintly and got to work, the sound of his tools filling the silence as the first rays of dawn began to creep through the trees.